Buckingham Palace has announced that Prince Andrew is returning his royal and military titles to the Queen.
The great Prince Charming, adored by the public and hailed for his manners and royal charm, has finally been stripped of his golden facade. What the world once saw as elegance, grace, and the poise of a distinguished royal was merely a mask. Behind the polished exterior and the carefully curated public appearances lurked a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. One of his former maids, Charlotte Briggs, has pulled back the velvet curtain of Buckingham Palace, revealing the man beneath the crown, a man whose actions and attitudes are anything but regal. Now the world is seeing Prince Andrew for what he truly is, a rotten, privileged son of a crown whose charm was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. Charlotte Briggs's revelations do more than shock. They make sense of a lifetime of rumors, inconsistencies, and whispers that never quite added up. From the outside, Andrew appeared to live a life of effortless luxury, a life many dreamed of. But inside the palace walls, the story was starkly different. The young maid's accounts expose a man who thrived on the submission of others, who demanded perfection and obedience, and who had little regard for the feelings of those around him. The narrative she provides is not just about moments of anger or fleeting tantrums. It is a portrait of a man whose cruelty was cultivated over decades, embedded in his personality from a young age. As we explore the insider's account, the image of Andrew as a charming Duke of York begins to crumble. It is replaced with the reality of a figure whose entitled nature and unfiltered temper made life unbearable for the staff tasked with serving him. The public may have seen a polished exterior, but Charlotte's testimony shows a man who was never charming behind closed doors, a man whose habits, demands, and obsessions reveal a profound sense of insecurity masked by arrogance. The revelations force us to reconsider what we believed we knew. He was not transformed by circumstance. He was always this way, and it took an insider brave enough to speak the truth to unveil the reality. Charlotte Briggs was only 21 when she stepped into the world of royalty, armed with dreams of service, ambition, and an idealistic belief that love and kindness could bring out the best in people. She imagined herself part of the glamour of palace halls, assisting those she admired, and perhaps learning lessons in refinement and grace. She believed in the nobility of her role, convinced that loyalty and affection could inspire goodness even in those who seemed difficult. What Charlotte did not foresee, however, was the toxicity of the environment into which she was entering. Buckingham Palace, with its grandeur and historic charm, was not merely a workplace. It was a stage where the Duke of York's whims dictated the lives of those who served him. To Charlotte, the experience was meant to be transformative, a chance to witness royalty at close quarters. Instead, it became a sobering lesson in the limits of idealism. No amount of care, patience, or diligence could temper the harshness, the volatility, or the cruelty of a man raised in privilege and left unchecked by responsibility. Her initial enthusiasm was quickly replaced with fear and disillusionment. She began to understand that some individuals, no matter how much love or respect you offer, are impervious to kindness. The lessons she learned were harsh, unforgettable, and revealing. Andrew's behavior was not an anomaly or a momentary lapse. It was consistent, entrenched, and designed to assert dominance over those around him. Through her eyes, we see the contrast between the public perception of royalty and the private reality, a gap that Charlotte navigated daily with trepidation and anxiety. Charlotte's story is essential not only because of the sensational nature of the claims, but because it offers a glimpse into the psychology of someone shielded by privilege yet untempered by consequence. She observed, endured, and now recounts the truth with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. What follows is the testimony of someone who witnessed from the inside the habits, the temper, and the obsessions of a man whose reputation as a gentleman is irreparably contradicted by his private behavior. From the first moment Charlotte entered Prince Andrew's world, she was struck by the gap between expectation and reality. The palace promised prestige, an introduction to history, and the satisfaction of serving a figurehead. What she found instead was a man whose charm existed only in public appearances, a persona carefully polished for cameras and guests. While behind closed doors, he revealed a temperament that was both volatile and entitled. Her earliest memories of the Duke of York are filled with contradictions. On one hand, he was a figure of fascination, draped in the trappings of royalty. On the other, he was lazy, arrogant, and easily provoked. Tasks that seemed trivial to anyone else were treated as offenses if not completed to his exacting standards. A simple oversight could trigger a cascade of anger, leaving staff trembling under the weight of his disapproval. "I did everything I could to avoid him," Charlotte admitted, describing a life lived in the shadow of unpredictability. His presence was unsettling, and his reactions were extreme, disproportionate to any mistake or failure. What made the environment even more challenging was the sense that nothing could placate him. Andrew's dissatisfaction was constant, and his expectations impossible to meet. Minor infractions, from a slightly misaligned curtain to the incorrect positioning of objects, could provoke explosive responses. The young maid's recounting of these moments paints a vivid picture. A man who wielded power not as a responsibility, but as a weapon against those who served him. Every day brought a fresh trial of nerves and composure, a reality starkly at odds with the fairy tale image of a princely figure navigating palace life with grace and ease. Charlotte Briggs' accounts detail the extent of Andrew's authoritarian tendencies. One of the first examples she recalls is his obsession with curtains. Heavy floor-to-ceiling drapes, easily adjustable by any adult, became a source of conflict. If a gap was left, even inadvertently, Andrew would erupt, storming from the room with shouts echoing down the palace corridors. "Can't you bloody do anything right?" he would scream, leaving young maids reduced to tears. The level of scrutiny was suffocating, and mistakes, however minor, were never tolerated. But the tantrums were just one aspect of his control. He demanded staff be hyper-vigilant, constantly aware of his presence and moods. One wrong step or a moment of inattentiveness could result in verbal abuse or punitive measures, reinforcing a system of fear. This environment cultivated constant anxiety among the staff, who learned to anticipate his temper and adjust their behavior accordingly. It was a world in which perfection was impossible, yet deviation carried a disproportionate consequence. Andrew's public persona, in stark contrast, was that of a relaxed, charming royal. His smiles at events, his polite gestures, and his cultivated image as a sophisticated duke were tools that concealed his true nature. Charlotte's testimony strips away this facade, revealing a man who thrived on the discomfort and submission of others. His cruelty was not hidden. It was structural, embedded in the daily operations of his household, and experienced firsthand by those who served him with diligence and dedication. Among the more unusual details Charlotte shared was Andrew's obsessive attachment to his collection of stuffed animals. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a harmless quirk, a whimsical fondness for childhood toys. To those charged with maintaining it, it was a meticulous ritual that dictated their every move. 72 teddy bears, alongside a stuffed hippo and a black panther, were to be arranged with military precision. Laminated sheets provided explicit instructions on placement, orientation, and positioning. Even his two favorite bears had designated spots flanking his bed. Like sentinels maintaining vigilance, every morning and evening, the toys were moved according to these instructions, and any misstep could provoke a severe reaction. The bedroom itself became a shrine to symmetry and control. Pillows embroidered with the royal crest had to be perfectly aligned. Pajamas laid out with absolute order, and toys removed before sleep only to be returned at dawn. The routine was exhausting, psychologically taxing, and emblematic of Andrew's need for control over his environment and the people within it. For Charlotte and the staff, the experience was far from quaint. It was an exercise in fear management, patience, and relentless attention to detail. What might seem like a harmless eccentricity was, in reality, a mechanism through which Andrew asserted dominance, ensuring that even mundane aspects of daily life reinforced his authority and tested the loyalty and competence of those around him. The contrast between Andrew's polished public persona and his private behavior was stark. The press eagerly seized on stories about the Duke's eccentricities, often portraying him as a man clinging to childhood habits in a humorous or harmless light. To the public, he was quirky, endearing, perhaps even charmingly awkward. Behind the palace walls, however, the truth was far more disturbing. Charlotte's accounts, corroborated by other former staff members, reveal a pattern of intimidation, humiliation, and entitlement. Andrew did not merely demand service, he demanded subservience. His treatment of staff, even in comparison to other royals such as Charles, Edward, or Prince Philip, was cruel and devoid of gratitude. While his siblings could be stern but fair, Andrew's behavior was marked by arbitrary cruelty, obsessive control, and a lack of empathy, creating a toxic environment that rendered palace life unbearable. The seeds of Andrew's behavior were sown in childhood. Observers noted his propensity for cruelty even as a toddler. Unlike his siblings, who displayed curiosity, stubbornness, or quiet intelligence, Andrew's early conduct suggested a desire to dominate and control. He mocked palace guards, taunted animals, and bullied his younger brother Edward. The Duke's behavior was not playful mischief, but a deliberate assertion of superiority, a habit that would evolve into the adult cruelty described by Charlotte Briggs. Staff intervened on multiple occasions, administering punishments outside formal royal protocols to curb his behavior. Once he was shoved into horse dung after striking animals, a grotesque but necessary lesson in consequences. Another time, a footman retaliated for relentless teasing, leaving young Andrew with a black eye, an incident even the Queen tacitly approved of. These formative experiences reveal a pattern of entitlement and aggression, cultivated early and left unchecked by privilege, shaping a man who thrived on dominance and humiliation. Charlotte's testimony is not merely anecdotal. It highlights a consistent pattern. Andrew relished humiliating others, sought control through submission, and maintained a household structured around fear and obedience. His behavior was obsessive, meticulous, and often absurd, but always designed to reinforce his superiority and ensure compliance. Privilege insulated him from consequence, emboldening traits that might have been tempered under different circumstances. In the end, Charlotte Briggs's revelations paint a portrait of a man whose cruelty, obsession, and entitlement were lifelong traits. The Duke of York's public charm is shattered when contrasted with his private behavior, a man who demands, intimidates, and humiliates, shielded by privilege and enabled by silence. Her testimony offers a glimpse into the toxic reality behind Buckingham Palace's doors, forcing us to re-evaluate the myth of the charming royal. Prince Andrew was never transformed by circumstance. He was never the innocent, charismatic figure admired by the public. He was always a man shaped by privilege, a lifelong pattern of cruelty, and a relentless desire for control, revealed only through the courage of those who served him and dared to speak the truth. Prince Andrew's behavior extended beyond the palace staff. Even when interacting with high-profile visitors, his entitlement and impulsiveness became apparent. Whether dignitaries, celebrities, or visiting royals were present, Andrew seemed driven by a need to assert dominance or seek attention, often at the expense of decorum. Staff recount instances where he interrupted official conversations to insert inappropriate jokes or boast about personal exploits. A simple handshake or introduction could quickly become an opportunity for him to display superiority, leaving the visitor confused and the staff scrambling to maintain decorum. The young maids and butlers who observed these moments often felt the weight of responsibility. Their role was no longer merely serving. It was damage control, a constant effort to prevent Andrew's childish impulses from embarrassing the royal household publicly. While cameras captured his charm and charisma for the public, the insiders witnessed a man who seemed incapable of restraint or self-awareness, whose obsession with image and approval often collided with the basic requirements of polite interaction. The relentless pressure and constant unpredictability took a significant toll on those serving the Duke of York. Staff members described walking on eggshells every moment of every day, terrified of triggering his wrath over even the smallest oversight. Anxiety became their constant companion. Sleep was interrupted by nightmares of mistakes or imagined confrontations. Charlotte Briggs recalled leaving her shifts in tears, overwhelmed by the dual burden of perfection demanded by Andrew and the physical exhaustion of performing tasks under scrutiny. Others reported feeling trapped in a cycle of fear, guilt, and submission, where even a momentary lapse could provoke humiliation or punishment. The psychological toll was cumulative, affecting their confidence, mental health, and their ability to trust authority figures. For the staff, the palace became less a place of prestige and more a minefield of tension, where every misstep carried consequences far beyond reason. Andrew's behavior did not exist in isolation. It was sustained in part by the palace hierarchy and the culture of silence that surrounded him. Senior staff often turned a blind eye or quietly tolerated his whims, aware that challenging him could lead to conflict or career repercussions. Even members of the royal family seemed hesitant to intervene, creating an environment where his cruel tendencies could flourish unchecked. This complicity, whether intentional or not, became an enabler. The system around Andrew was structured in such a way that his outbursts and obsessions could continue with minimal interference. In contrast, other royals, such as Charles, Edward, or Prince Philip, maintained a level of professionalism and courtesy that emphasized respect over fear, highlighting just how singularly toxic Andrew's household had become. The silence of those around him was a silent consent, allowing his cruelty to fester and grow. Publicly, Andrew maintained a persona of charm, wit, and approachability. Interviews, photographs, and appearances were carefully orchestrated to convey the image of a confident, sophisticated royal. Media outlets often perpetuated this image, focusing on his smile, his interactions with guests, and his visible ease in formal settings. Behind the cameras, however, the reality was starkly different. Staff knew that these moments of public polish required immense preparation and control. They were witnesses to the backstage chaos, the tantrums, obsessive rituals, and subtle manipulations that ensured the public saw only what Andrew wanted them to see. While the media lauded him for charm and elegance, those who lived with him daily understood that this image was a carefully maintained illusion, concealing a man driven by insecurity, control, and cruelty. Andrew's personal demands often disrupted traditional palace routines, imposing chaos on practices that had existed for decades. Simple rituals, cleaning, room arrangements, and personal scheduling became exercises in fear management. Staff were forced to adapt constantly to Andrew's capricious rules, ensuring that every detail, no matter how trivial, adhered to his expectations. These disruptions were not only a source of stress, but also undermined the dignity and function of the household. Long-standing traditions were bent, reshaped, or abandoned entirely to accommodate Andrew's compulsions, leaving staff frustrated and demoralized. What might appear as minor eccentricities to outsiders carried profound consequences for those who had to implement them daily. Andrew's toxic behavior extended to his immediate family. His relationship with his siblings, Charles, Anne, and Edward, was marked by rivalry, domination, and occasional cruelty. Interactions with Edward, in particular, reflected a pattern of bullying, where Andrew would snatch food, shove, or engage in petty harassment to assert his superiority. These were not mere childhood squabbles. They were deliberate acts of control and intimidation, a consistent theme in his behavior. Observers and staff noted that Andrew's need to dominate extended to every relationship, creating tension even within the royal household. His siblings, in contrast, displayed typical familial dynamics tempered by affection, cooperation, or measured rivalry. Andrew's conduct, however, was singular in its harshness and unrelenting drive to assert control. Charlotte Briggs was not alone in her observations. Other former staff members corroborated her testimony, recounting similar experiences of fear, humiliation, and excessive demands. Recurring themes emerged: obsession with order, cruelty, entitlement, and a lack of empathy. One ex-maid described rushing across a room to close curtains that Andrew himself stood beside, an act designed purely to reinforce hierarchy. Another recalled receiving cold, condescending remarks during simple exchanges, a constant reminder of his perceived superiority. These accounts collectively paint a picture of a household dominated by fear, obsession, and relentless control, where even minor infractions were magnified into lessons in submission. From a psychological standpoint, Andrew's behavior suggests patterns of entitlement, narcissism, and arrested emotional development. Privilege insulated him from consequences, allowing childish impulses to persist into adulthood. His obsessive rituals, punitive temper, and delight in humiliating others reveal a man both fragile and dangerous. Fragile because he could not tolerate imperfection. Dangerous because he sought to impose control at all costs. Insiders' accounts highlight a paradox. Andrew simultaneously craved admiration and sought domination, masking insecurity behind aggression and eccentricity. The palace, in many ways, provided the perfect environment for such traits to flourish, giving him both the power and insulation to act without fear of repercussion. The effects of Andrew's behavior left a lasting mark on palace staff. The environment he cultivated created a culture of fear and submission that persisted long after any individual encounter. Former employees recalled constant vigilance, anticipating tantrums and obsessively double-checking tasks. For many, the psychological scars endured, shaping perceptions of authority, hierarchy, and interpersonal interaction. The palace, a symbol of elegance and tradition, became a space of tension, anxiety, and emotional labor, where the whims of a single privileged individual dictated the daily reality of all who served him. The narrative of Prince Andrew is one of stark contrasts. Publicly, he appeared charming, composed, and dignified. Privately, he was cruel, obsessive, and entitled, thriving on the submission of those around him. Staff testimonies reveal a man who weaponized privilege, indulged eccentricities, and created a toxic household environment. Charlotte Briggs' revelations, supported by other former staff, strip away the myth of charm and reveal a lifelong pattern of arrogance, cruelty, and obsession. The man behind the crown was never transformed by circumstance. He was always this way. The contrast between public image and private reality is jarring, offering a glimpse into the world behind Buckingham Palace's velvet curtains, a world where fear, humiliation, and meticulous control reigned supreme. In the end, the Duke of York's story is not one of innocence or charm. It is a story of entitlement, privilege, and unmitigated cruelty, exposed only by those courageous enough to tell the truth. The world may have admired him from afar, but the insiders who lived under his gaze knew the real man, the man behind the crown, unmasked, unforgiving, and unrepentant. Prince Andrew's world was one of endless indulgence, a gilded cage built on extravagance and unchecked privilege. Staff recall being tasked with fulfilling excessive and often unnecessary orders. Lavish decorations, expensive furniture, and personal luxuries that served little purpose beyond satisfying the Duke's whims. From gold-plated items to elaborate room arrangements, the demands were relentless, exhausting those who served him both physically and mentally. Behind the public's admiration for royal elegance lay a life of waste and overindulgence. Every order reflected not refinement, but a need to assert status and control. The maids and butlers who labored to maintain this opulence often felt resentment brewing, a quiet acknowledgement that this extravagance was not only excessive, but imposed upon them at the expense of dignity and peace. What the world saw as a princely lifestyle, insiders knew as a life where privilege demanded obedience and admiration, leaving no room for personal autonomy or professional satisfaction. Andrew's compulsions extended beyond possessions and into his own personal appearance. He demanded meticulous attention to every detail of grooming, clothing, and presentation. Staff were trained to anticipate his slightest discomfort, whether a wrinkle in his attire, a misaligned collar, or a hair out of place. Even informal events could trigger extensive preparations, with minor imperfections provoking anger or public embarrassment. These rituals were not about style or aesthetics, but control. By asserting dominance over the minutiae of his own image, Andrew projected power while simultaneously revealing insecurity. The staff quickly learned that perfection was never enough. Their lives became consumed by anticipation, correction, and the management of his ever-watchful eye. Each day required vigilance, with errors punished or remembered, leaving a lasting impression of fear and submission. Despite his ceremonial role, Andrew rarely took responsibility seriously. Duties that were his by title alone were often delegated or ignored, forcing staff to execute tasks while he observed or interfered with critique. Reports from palace insiders suggest a man more interested in comfort, indulgence, and attention than in fulfilling even the modest responsibilities expected of a duke. This lack of accountability further exacerbated tensions among staff. They were not only required to manage his personal whims, but also to compensate for the avoidance of responsibility, creating a workload far beyond reasonable expectations. What was intended as ceremonial service became a daily exercise in patience, restraint, and survival. Andrew's avoidance of duty reinforced his pattern of entitlement. He expected others to labor while he enjoyed the privileges of his status without consequence. Public. Scandals later exposed facets of Andrew's behavior that insiders had witnessed for years. Whether through questionable associations, media scrutiny, or legal entanglements, his private conduct often mirrored the arrogance, impulsiveness, and entitlement seen behind palace walls. Staff recount moments when these controversies loomed over their daily work, generating fear and anxiety as they anticipated fallout or interference in their routines. The juxtaposition was stark. While he presented an image of charm and composure in public, the very traits that led to scandal were cultivated privately over decades: manipulation, control, and the dismissal of consequence. These patterns of behavior foreshadowed public controversies, making the staff's insider perspective crucial for understanding the man behind the headlines. Though staff and even senior palace figures occasionally attempted to correct Andrew's behavior, their efforts were often met with tantrums, passive-aggressive retaliation, or only temporary compliance. Whether it was a misaligned item, a minor breach of protocol, or an attempt to enforce boundaries, Andrew's responses reinforced the futility of resistance. This cyclical pattern of attempted discipline and failure became a defining feature of his household. Staff would try to assert reasonable limits only to see their authority undermined, leaving them demoralized and resigned. Over time, the repeated failures solidified a toxic dynamic where fear and obedience replaced respect and professionalism. The culture Andrew cultivated extended far beyond his personal interactions. Staff learned to anticipate whims, navigate volatile moods, and adhere to obsessive rituals, embedding fear and hypervigilance into daily life. The toxic atmosphere he created altered norms, eroding the dignity and cohesion of the household. Compared to other royal households, where professionalism and respect guided interactions, Andrew's environment stood out for its unpredictability and psychological strain. Insiders described the experience as emotionally exhausting, noting that the palace had become less a symbol of history and prestige and more a theater of anxiety and obedience. Andrew's behavior became more striking when contrasted with his siblings and peers. Charles, Edward, and Anne, while each with their own personalities and quirks, displayed professionalism, courtesy, and a measure of empathy that Andrew consistently lacked. While his siblings commanded respect without intimidation, Andrew demanded subservience, delighting in humiliation and control. This comparison highlights the role of privilege in shaping Andrew's behavior. Shielded from consequences and elevated above peers, he cultivated cruelty and obsession without check. The stark contrast serves as a lens through which to understand his patterns, emphasizing how unmoderated privilege can distort character and conduct. Multiple palace insiders corroborated Charlotte Briggs's account, adding depth to her testimony. Long-serving staff recounted repeated instances of unpredictability, obsessive control, and condescending treatment. Minor mistakes were met with disproportionate reactions, while eccentric rituals and compulsions dominated daily routines. These accounts confirmed that Andrew's behavior was not isolated or exaggerated. Instead, they reveal a systemic pattern, a household ruled by fear and submission, where the personal whims of the Duke dictated reality for everyone under his roof. The testimony of these observers reinforces the picture of a man driven not by charm or leadership, but by a desire for dominance and unquestioned compliance. Andrew and the palace administration often worked to manage public perception, suppressing reports or quietly reassigning staff to maintain appearances. The meticulous effort to conceal his tantrums, obsessions, and abuses from public view highlights the contrast between the carefully curated image and private reality. Behind the curtains of Buckingham Palace, staff endured behavior that the public would have found scandalous. While media coverage occasionally hinted at eccentricity, it rarely captured the depth of the cruelty, obsession, and entitlement revealed by insiders. The effort to mask these behaviors further emphasizes Andrew's obsession with control and image. The long-term effects of Andrew's conduct are evident in the emotional and psychological scars reported by staff. Many experienced lingering anxiety, hypervigilance, and a deep-seated wariness of authority. The toxic environment he created affected not only individuals